Once again, Ron, alcoholic, very appreciative that I get to continue to do this with this third session. Strengths-based life and recovery kind of brings it all together. My sobriety date, once again, December 28th, 1985, and coming up on 37 years, assuming I keep doing this one day at a time. So I thought I might start with a little bit different direction, just have a little bit of fun. So I went off and did a little bit of research, and I found this. You'll probably know who this is a quote from. It goes like this: "Today you are you. That is truer than true. There is no one alive who is youer than you." And if you guessed Dr. Seuss, you were exactly right. I thought it's so in the spirit of this idea of strengths, which are unique to us. But I'd be remiss, because you never know, someone may drop in and listen to this video first, or you all may need a quick revisitation. So a little bit to revisit, to do the reframe. What we've been talking about before we get to this idea of strengths is that we start with getting clean and sober, because not much good comes till we put down the drink, the drug, whatever. And then the first time we go through the steps, it's usually to clean up a bunch of crap in our life, especially because we need to feel better about ourselves and because it gives us a chance to let go of some shame and guilt, which are really, really problematic from the standpoint of sustaining recovery. Then at some point, lots of us have to do a deeper dive into the same steps, where we begin to look at our old ideas, the decisions based on self, big book language. And then, as I've mentioned before, from Bill's letter in 1957, to try and understand how we were damaged by life. So that's an entirely different kind of inventory, which isn't about our behaviors, looking to root causes. And somewhere along the way, we get a chance to start looking at what originally was called assets inventory. But we're talking about strengths or talents, and that these are additive. I think I mentioned that we don't generally start with strengths because there are things that are really going to get in the way, hence our starting point with shame, guilt, bad behavior, etc. So regardless, eventually we get a chance to start looking at this other side of us. And here's what we know. Everyone has strengths. It's simply because you were born with a genetic code into a family and community setting, and at some point in time, you became anomalously good at certain aptitudes, talents, strengths, ways of being. Now, sometimes what we inventory when we start this recovery process is actually the flip side of a strength, because it turns out we can have strengths that, when practiced in another way, can prove to be problems. For example, and this is a real example, I have a friend in recovery who was often accused of being wishy-washy and indecisive and all those sorts of things. Well, it turns out he has a strength known as arranger. And the arranger has this amazing capacity to change direction, adapt, etc. Amazingly enough, during the COVID time, this arranger capability has been on the front lines of responding in the pandemic brilliantly, because the same aptitude, which in one lens, perhaps the basement as we've talked about it, looks like wishy-washy and indecisive, but in the right setting is actually a powerful asset, a powerful strength. Oftentimes we find this in people in recovery, this kind of a strength, oftentimes with nurses who do triage, people in emergency rooms, people on the front lines of response. They have this ability to just adapt and adjust. In fact, I know several people who in their recovery have found themselves as frontline responders. And it's a brilliant talent that works really, really well in some settings. So that can be the flip side of a strength. We gave you a tool, a couple of tools, StrengthsFinder 2.0, and also Top 5 by Gallup. Again, just to repeat, I don't make any money off those. They're just tools that we can use. And they can help us so that we can see more clearly these strengths that all of us have. It's like that line in We agnostics, I mentioned, somewhere deep down inside every man and woman, there's the fundamental idea of God, which comes in the form of strengths sometimes. And then we talked about the idea of balconies and basements, that any given strength can take you up, like the example I was just using with the arranger. It can also take you down into the basement to be low functioning, etc. And then the last thing we did to set the scene was stolen from the Enneagram. Enneagram is a psychological assessment tool. And what it proposes is that our goal, because you are youer than you, right? I mean, you that's you. It's exactly who you are. And what the Enneagram proposes is that what we're looking to do is for you to become the most functional and integrated version of yourself. We might call that healthy or whole or well. And unfortunately, if we don't do this deeper work, many of us end up dysfunctional and disintegrated because we don't do the upward spiraling with the basic download that we have within us. We instead go down. And that can happen even though we're sober. Many of you know the notion of, dry drunks and people who run into other kinds of problems in sobriety. So really what this is proposing, we have to lean into an advance in our recovery, which I refer to as a progressive recovery. So when we talked last time, we were talking about the fourth step. And just to reframe, the fourth step in the big book is the person or the circumstance, the setting, what happened. That's column 2. Column 3 is how it affected us. Everything from making us feel insecure, threatening our finances, sex relations, etc. And then column 4 is our part, as it's often called, although I've reframed that into what we're bringing to this particular situation, this particular dynamic. So there are 4 columns, and I actually walked through how one might do that. And then I told you we would go through more steps. So I want to walk you through this way of thinking with the steps. And the first example I'm going to use is actually in the book, Progressive Recovery Through the 12 Steps, Emotionally Sober for Life. I tell the story of Jennifer. Now, Jennifer is a composite of a number of women. I've talked through this. I'll have a male example here in a minute. Jennifer's story is a bunch of bad relationships. Oftentimes in the rooms, we might hear someone like Jennifer. We might hear someone say she has a broken picker. She keeps picking guys who are problematic. At worst, they're neglectful, abandoning, etc., perhaps betraying. Well, Jennifer's simple story, when we look at this, and then I'm going to walk you through the steps with it. Jennifer was damaged by life. There's that language from Bill, because her family of origin included a series of unstable, unpredictable, unreliable men. Her mama had a broken picker. Her mama put into place these unreliable, unstable men who could not be counted on. And so what Jennifer learned deep in her being was to pick those kind of people. Now, what's cool about this is that it created in Jennifer exactly what we talked about. There's a powerful set of strengths in this that I'm going to tell you about in a moment. But at least at the point in time where Jennifer is getting started, we might label her codependent, right? Or we might talk about her as having dysfunctional male relationships. So when Jennifer, composite again, when she does this 4th and 5th step, she, of course, has to account for all the damaging relationships she's had, which span, and this is a fairly common story, which span all the way from before she even started drinking to once she started drinking. Throughout her drinking history, she got sober. She kept picking these guys who at worst were unavailable, or at best were unavailable. At worst, they might have been downright abusive. In fact, I remember sitting in a meeting listening to a woman talk about this. She was about 10 years sober, and she was talking about this guy she had found, and she's just talking wonderful stuff about him. And I know this guy. And I'm thinking, this is not going to turn out well. Well, it took her 5 years to find out after marrying him, that it wasn't that he was physically abusive, he was emotionally abusive, and she couldn't see it. She'd picked one more form. So she was damaged by life. She has this broken picker problem. So in her inventory, that's what she started to look at. In column 4 of the inventory, Jennifer has to start looking at this whole history. And she has to start seeing things like, well, when you pick a damaged guy, you get to feel superior. You feel better about yourself. When you pick a damaged guy, you get to feel responsible. You get to feel like you're the committed party in the relationship. You're the go-to person, all of which is deeply ego gratifying. And of course, it feeds on itself. So what Jennifer realizes is that she has got to get done with this. So she does a 6 and 7, step 6 and 7. Step 6 and 7 is where we ask higher power for assistance with this problem. So Jennifer can't just say, fix my broken picker, God. Jennifer has to tell the story out loud to her higher power about this whole history, about this history of what happened to her, how she has this ego attachment to being the go-to in the relationship, that she's unable to pick men who are healthy. And then she has to ask higher power for some kind of assistance with this. Now, if we introduce strengths, we might say that the 7th step becomes higher power. I need to let go of some dysfunctional parts of my aptitudes. I need something more functional, something that's in the balcony. I need help. I don't know how to find it. I've lived my whole life stuck in this way. I'm going to need some help because I don't even know what the solution looks like. Now, I'm going to tell a quick funny story about me. I know this story, even though I'm not Jennifer, because when I went off for treatment for love addiction, which I did at 17 years sober because I train wrecked one more relationship, and I was actually in an AA meeting in Austin, Texas, and there was this blonde who I was just gonzo over. Well, I talked to this blonde, and then I came back to my sponsor, and I talked with him about it, and I said, my God, I am so attracted to her, but geez, she is like 3 months clean and sober. She came in here coming off hard drugs. She's got no visible means of support. She has 4 children. Actually, she has 3 because the 4th one died when she was loaded, which is what got her in here. She's got 3 different fathers. None of them pay child support. She is a mess. And I said to my sponsor, I said, and I am so attracted to her, I can't stand it. And he said, well, what are we going to do? And I said, we are going to go do some inventory work because I can finally see it. This imprint in me had set me up one more time, even though I'd just come back from treatment for love addiction. I include me in that to know that Jennifer is not hypothetical. It's something I myself have lived, the inability to pick someone who's healthy. So we go into steps 8 and 9, the amends making. Traditional amends making would be, who do you go back to say, I screwed up, let me make it right. Might be an apology, might be some kind of other restitution. The idea of what we're going to do with strengths, though, is the idea of living into a set of new ideas, which would be strengths as opposed to these deficits that we've been encountering. So in the end, the amended life begins to look like doing the things necessary to come from a place of strengths rather than deficits, or balcony rather than basement. That's different than saying I'm sorry or paying someone the money you stole from them or whatever. And in order to do that, Jennifer has to get therapeutic support because she can't. I'm a sponsor, and the 12 steps are not all she needs. She gets therapeutic support, and she gets a spiritual advisor. She is trying to live her way into a new way of being, because picking problematic guys is a symptom. It turns out she has a low sense of herself, poor self-esteem. She doesn't think she's lovable. Of course, she would pick people like that so that she could demonstrate and rescue them and they would love her. And so the eventual strengths embodied 9th step solution is for her to let go of those old damaged identities. Now that means we need step 7, there isn't any way I can just stop thinking about myself the way I think about myself. It just doesn't work. I got to have serious higher power help. I'm going to have therapists in many cases, some of us. And then I'm going to have to try and live my way into an amended being. And I say that way because she has to become a person who has enough sense of self-worth, enough dignity, enough well-being, that she no longer has to pick people who play out that pattern with her. And then as part of her amends, she gets to start practicing this with other women. I do know more than a few women that a big part of their 12th step work now, although I look at it as 9th step, is they're actually teaching other women how to break this cycle, which is an advanced practice in recovery. And it's one that's really useful, and it applies to men as well. So then we get into 10th step and 11th step. The 10th step, I mentioned this last time, the 10th step says we have entered the realm of the spirit. Our next function is to grow in understanding and effectiveness. The 10th step is not just an accounting of the things we do wrong, although we do continue to do things that need addressing. So in steps 10 and 11, I get a chance to try and increase my connection to higher power, to this higher self, if you prefer, the self that is coming from a strengths-based balcony orientation, rather than the dysfunction and disintegration that previously dated me. And my first sponsor said, Ron, the solution to our problem is conscious contact. Higher power is the solution to our powerlessness. And so we're trying to connect to this so we can be healed and made right. And then the 12th step, as I mentioned, is Jennifer actually practicing this with this way of being, this way of healing, this way of doing step work with other women. So what we're able to do is to take the same 12 steps, we're able to work them at depth in column 4 of the inventory. We're able to look at our strengths. So literally at this point, Jennifer can look at an interaction with a guy, and she can appraise whether or not she's moving to dysfunction and disintegration with it, the basement, or whether she's moving towards function and integration, the balcony. She's becoming more and more strengths embodied is the language I like to use. And she can use the same steps. And the 10th step proposes we continue to watch is the language. We continue to watch, and we come back over and over and over again watching for this, like what I had to have happen to me in the AA meeting in Austin, Texas, with the blonde that I was just gobsmacked by. I roll my eyes because it's like, how, man, I should have known better, but I couldn't stop the sense of attraction. So we can use these same 12 steps, and we can literally watch the dysfunction, disintegration, and we can watch the integration and function, and we can do both sides of this. Now, I told you I would connect this directly. So Jennifer went from being codependent, demanding, controlling, all those sorts of things. And when we look at her strengths, what we find in her are 4 probable strengths. One is she is empathetic. In her best form, she cares deeply. Another is the developer, which loves building people. In dysfunction, she was trying to fix broken men. In function, she's working with other women in recovery so that they too can grow. That's a strength. It's been refocused away from trying to repair broken people and not doing it, to working from a place of her own recovery, her own well-being. It turns out Jennifer has a strong restorative or problem solver strength. Used to be she kept trying to solve the unsolvable, a dysfunctional, abusive or neglectful guy. Now she's using that restorative work for herself. Maybe she gets married and has some kids. She can practice all of this with her family. She's certainly doing it with other women. And we find in Jennifer, and this is pretty common, a deep sense of responsibility. She felt responsible for the broken guy, just like she felt responsible for the broken men in her history. Well, The ultimate shift of responsibility is where we can be accountable to ourselves and to others. So that doesn't mean just being responsible for others. It means being true to herself. There's that motto of ours: to thine own self be true. And her original motivation is because she kept damaging her life. Her newer motivation is because this is the path of healing. This is the path of growth. So the very same 12 steps practiced from a strengths-based orientation. Now, I told you I'd use a guy example. This is a friend of mine in recovery named Andy. That's a pseudonym, but Andy, who had a terrible, terrible history of drug addiction, alcoholic too, but really, really was a crackhead. And man, it just damn near killed him. I watched him through that whole process. And he got so much criticism for for thinking too much. And admittedly, what happens with a broken thinker is it kind of eats on itself and spirals round and round and round. If you've got one of those thinkers, I have one of those, you know that it can be like a squirrel in your head, just running round and round and round and round, down every kind of squirrel hole. And so people would tell him things like, dude, you need to just stop thinking so hard about this. It's an easy program. Stop thinking. Well, he can't turn off his brain. He's got this really active, powerful thinker. And at this point, it's operating in dysfunction. Now, he was once told that what he had to do was to make friends with this so that he could learn how to use it as the tool that it was. But he's taken some heat and some shame, and he can't stop overthinking and all of that. And the result is that his life, in addition to being on crack and alcohol, his life is just an unending train wreck, one thing after another. And he's eat up by guilt and shame. And he finally does manage to put the drinks and the drugs down. Remember, that's our starting point. It's very hard to make progress until we put the drink and the drug down. And then his first few inventories were just brutal affairs where he would write pages of critique. So what he was doing, he was taking this strong thinker of his and he was directing it to all the ways he could self-abuse. Not surprisingly, Andy had a story of being abused as a kid. There it is again. He was damaged by life. He experienced a tremendous amount of abuse. Abuse became his normal. In fact, that overactive thinker was trying to find a way out of a hopeless situation as a little kid. So he came forward with this predisposition to overthinking. He came forward with a desperate need to get out of his own body because he hated himself so much. And when he and I first started doing this work together some years ago, I mean, literally, he was so self-hating that he would just sit and sob. Well, he managed to get clean and sober, and then he got through some of the steps. They were brutal affairs because he was being really punitive on himself, but we got some stuff cleaned up. And man, could he do inventory. That great thinker of his, Jesus, the inventory he could do. At some point in his recovery, he realized he was actually an extraordinarily good student, and he started studying not just the big book, which he became very conversant in. He started studying outside the realms of AA, and I watched him learn things that, I mean, I would try and follow some of what he was learning, and I could not keep up. He had a brilliant learning, thinking capacity. And of course, sometimes it would spiral back down and drive him crazy, and we'd have to spiral him back up. So he wasn't free of the basement, but he had this powerful thinker. Well, what ended up happening with Andy over the years was as he got on top of this stuff, he rebuilt his life, managed to stay clean and sober, did a number of inventories. Slowly but surely, the dysfunction and the disintegration began to diminish, and what began to awaken was this really, really capable thinker. Well, today, interestingly enough. He's a master carpenter and general contractor. He builds homes like it's amazing what he can do with the problems he can solve, his ability to see what's coming. And he's much in demand because he's really, really good at it. He's learned how to work with that thinker. And for our purposes, he's at a place now and has been for a little while where the people who come to him in recovery are, of course, people with thinking problems. Because he has learned how to work with the thinker. He's learned how to help other people work with the thinker. So he has, and I know this to be true, he has two of the strengths that come out in this assessment. One is analytical, which means he can ruminate on stuff. The other is intellection. Intellection means that he's got a really good thinker in his head, which is exactly what we've seen. So the same old story, right? He does his inventories, he cleans up his crap. A lot of it's shame-based at that point. He starts asking higher power for help in 6 and 7, but he's got to start up modeling himself a different mindset. His inventory work, his men's work for the longest time was just trying to clean up his affairs with people, which was a great place to start. But when I talked to him very recently, Andy said something profound to me. This is the sign of the inner shift. Andy was talking about working his way out of a broken relationship. He too has that history, as many of us do. And he said, Ron, I just can't do this anymore. I see how this happens. I see how I overthink these relationships. And so the result of that was this latest relationship, and we laugh about it. It only took him 3 weeks. The previous one was several years. The one before that was about a decade. So he's accelerating in his ability to find functionality and integration because the period of time that he can get back to his own wholeness is much, much shorter. So the result of this is he's got this business that's working really well. He's increasingly working with people. He's becoming someone who's sought out because all of that study he's demonstrated himself able to do is in fact very, very valuable to other people. He understands things in remarkable ways. And not surprisingly, sometimes people still accuse him of overthinking, but he's like, dude, I don't know. I mean, I got this thinker and I'm just going to think. But he's created a really healthy relationship with himself, which is ultimately what we're looking for with this. So again, same story, same steps. The stuff that was killing him, the stuff that became him when he was a kid, he was born with a good brain in a dysfunctional setting, turns out to be a remarkable asset and set of strengths that today are a big part of his life, and they only seem to be increasing. So I wanted to spend a few minutes as I segue out of that. I wanted to talk a little bit about what it's like to live in this strengths-based life in recovery. And I want to start by telling you, this is that last part, what it is like now. Well, there's far more going on here than there is just not drinking and drugging. That's in my rearview mirror. But I want to tell you firsthand the things I see in me and in people I've worked with this strengths-based progressive approach. A few years ago, I had for the first time, the opportunity to tell the story I'd wanted to tell for a while on a stage in front of 600 people at the Oceanfront Conference in Virginia Beach. And I knew I had to tell a different story. The story I had to tell is what it's like to be a person who is whole, who is psychologically healthy, who's emotionally well much of the time, not without mistakes, not without screw-ups, not without challenges. But I had to talk about it because I knew how afraid I was to talk about becoming a well person. Because the currency I discovered about myself is in holding on to our brokenness. As we upmodel ourselves, we have to change our relationship to ourselves. We have to get a new set of ideas about ourselves. And by every standard I know from the people I talk to, I mean, I'm 66 years old right now, and I'm told that I'm a really healthy guy, not without problems, not without difficulties, but I'm a really healthy guy. I handle life well. In part, that's because I know how to use these talents and aptitudes, and I've, of course, got a lot of recovery. I was just talking to a friend of mine who's been doing this approach for, I guess, about a decade. And she's 77 years old now. And my God, the stuff that has happened to her in the past 10 or 15 years as she's deepened her recovery, she's the most vibrant and vital 77-year-old woman I've ever met. She's like teaching yoga classes. All these students at the college in the town she lives in, they come to learn yoga from her. She's a master Pilates instructor. She's discovered art. She's a really fine painter. And you go like, wow, how does that happen? Well, when she was 64 or 65, she was stuck in this place, in this basement. So it's taken her about 12 years or so to work her way up into this. And you watch her and you just marvel at it. One of the women I worked with for a long time said it becomes the golden years. Now, I'm talking about this not to, it is important for us to have hope, right? It's important for us to know that there's far more than just not drinking and drugging, that we can find a way into this strengths-based progressive way of being, which is really quite remarkable. I could have never predicted this stuff. Another thing that I see is those of us who've gone down this path further, we can own our own reality. Now, that has two sides, just like strengths and deficits. Part of owning my own reality is being able to see the places that I really am really good at stuff. I know that sounds like heresy in these rooms. I'm supposed to talk about what a piece of crap I am. Well, I'm sorry. I've lived my way into this remarkable capacity to do leadership development work. I have a national client who has been paying me to help them build this stuff because it's all my strengths in action. I'm building a curriculum to develop 12,000 leaders. And I'm doing that not because I'm getting paid well, oh, that's nice. I'm doing it because I just love this work. I absolutely love it. And I get to hang out with people who want to become better. And it's like, wow, how cool is that? That plays to all my strengths. Another example of this I've seen is yet one more guy. We'll call him Chuck. I think I actually mentioned Chuck last week. Chuck has become this remarkable international sales manager, and he's got this terrible history of drug addiction and alcoholism. And he's still working some of this stuff out, but he's tapped his strengths and he's incredibly capable with people. As I mentioned with Chuck before, he used to use all those incredible relational skills to seduce people for nefarious purposes. Today, he brings them down the developmental path. So we get to own our own reality, which also includes, I was just talking to someone about this just a little while ago, we can own it when we screw up, when we go off the wrong end of this thing, when all of a sudden I get full of myself because I'm doing this highfalutin work, and the next thing you know, I'm saying or doing something that is just off the beam. I'm just off the tracks. I'm becoming dysfunctional. And in that moment, I can call myself to account. I can do the inventory one more time, own that I've gone into the basement, do the work of the steps, do the letting go, clean up my affairs, make things right. Most often, I can make them right before I've harmed anyone today. I still harm people. Sometimes it's in ways they don't even know they've been harmed, but I know I've harmed them because I can see what I've done and why I've done it. So I can own my own reality, both the really cool stuff and the stuff in me that is deficient, which is what I see all the time. Another woman I'm working with has become remarkable. She is going to create 12-step meetings for people coming off hard drugs who are on, I forget the name of the drug that they use to keep their cravings at bay, naloxone. because she found out, she realized that she's using all these empathy skills and positivity, relator, and she figured out that people who are on naloxone don't have any place to go because they can't go to an NA room and admit that they are using naloxone. So she's going to create meetings for people who need the 12 steps but are taking naloxone, to which I say, how about that? I could have never seen that coming. And what a gift that will be to help people moving in the right direction. I'm personally a complete fan of abstinence, but I also understand that if we can keep people from harming themselves and harming others while they figure this thing out, that's a really good outcome. And the 12 steps can help. So that's the ability to own our reality and do cool stuff. One of the things that is really neat for me is to be able to account. My first step was getting sober, cleaning up the crap. I mean, exactly what I walked through. The big piece for me was that damaged by life stuff. I had a lot of unfinished business from really trauma in my life, in my childhood. And in recent times, I've been aware that that stuff has been healed in me, that I'm no longer carrying it with me. It happened. I totally get it. I understand it. I can hold those people to account, but I can't hold it over their head anymore. There's a part in my strengths profile which takes me to a place of offering people what the great therapist Carl Rogers called unconditional positive regard, which means that I'm able to let you be who you are, even when you are where you are, even when you're doing heinous stuff. And I can accept you and not judge you. That was impossible 37 years ago. I was so filled with judgment of others. Well, what's happened, interestingly, there's that motto of ours, live and let live. The better I get at embodying who I am, my true self, the self I'm supposed to be true to, the more I become embodied in these strengths and the practice of them, the more emotionally sober I become as a result of these steps, the more I can let you be who you are. And I can have compassion for you. I can be thoughtful. I can be considerate. All of that stuff is the byproduct of this. It's the same thing I've seen in others. I was just talking with a woman who I've been in conversation for about 15 years with this. And she was telling me, her name is Gina. Gina was telling me that she goes into the rooms now with a wide open heart, and that she has been working with people who apparently are hopeless, and she's good at it. And they may never get sober, but she's working with them from a place of a healed heart, which is amazing because she was so broken. What Gina told me one day when she first got started on this was that she was despairing at 30 years sober because she was stuck. She would tell me later that she was holding on to her final, at 30 years sober, she was holding on to her final solution, which was if things got bad enough, she could kill herself. Now, I realize we shouldn't talk about it. It's like, oh my God, that's terrible stuff. We shouldn't talk about that in recovery. Oh, yes, we should. Because there are people who are holding on to that stuff from their brokenness, their unfulfilledness. And she told me that when she finally got enough of that healed, she's now strongly in some of the relational strengths. She has, for the first time, let go of that as a fallback option. She doesn't need it anymore. That's a profound improvement in her mental and spiritual health. And again, I know this makes people uncomfortable because we're all supposed to be happy, joyous, and free. But I mean, my experience of recovery is that happy, joyous, and free comes with regular revelations of stuff I didn't know I was going to need to deal with. And most of it doesn't make me happy to see it. But it keeps happening. I keep showing up. It's like, oh no, there's one more thing I have to work on. In fact, I just had some inventory I did this week. For me, the marker of this strengths-based progressive recovery that matters the most, when I was in early recovery, my sponsor at the time told me that he saw that I had a terrible problem with discontentedness. And he was right. I couldn't see it at first. I was always discontented with whatever. There was always something to be discontented about. Well, the good news is that from a strengths point of view, what was fueling the discontent was some of my strengths that really wants to learn these things so I can figure them out. Part of which was so I can control my own life, which is not exactly the right reason, but it drove me. And the result of that is that the discontent I experienced was actually a sign of being in the basement with my strengths and drove me upstream. And the most remarkable thing for me is that I have been free of discontent for, I don't even know how long. It's like my first sponsor told me, the way the steps work is in the dark of night, and you wake up one morning and you realize something has been profoundly changed in you, but you don't know how and you don't know when. That's the way this work happens, is you suddenly realize you're different. And so today I can tell you, I'm mostly contented most of the time. Again, not without challenges. I have my moments. I've been just recently with some of the work I do, I've been battling bureaucratic behemoths. That's big language. I've just run into, and it's so hard to work your way through some of this stuff. And so I have my moments of wanting to scream, take a breath, come back to center. That's the basement. Let's get to the balcony. Let's figure out how to navigate this. I do have some talents for these, so let's figure that out. So I want to keep saying that because it's so important to realize that we don't have to hold on exclusively to brokenness in order to continue to move forward. I can allow, in fact, one of my spiritual teachers now says that a sign of spiritual maturity is to allow both the brokenness and the healedness to coexist. It's not one or the other. I'm not a broken human being. I'm actually a fairly healthy human being today, fairly integrated, fairly functional, with regular retreats into dysfunction. And so when they talk about that in terms of the spiral of development, it's like, yeah, I'm getting better and better and better. And periodically I spin back down. But because of all the practice, I can spin back up much more readily, which is why we have a 10th step to continue to watch, both for the things we do positively and the things where we're running off the rails. So the amazing thing to me today, and I'm just realizing this for the first time tonight. This is fresh. This is the first time I've ever talked about being a fairly healthy human being, that I haven't had some pangs of concern that you all might see me badly because I'm not talking about all the things I do wrong. Something inside me has been right enough that I can own this and go, yeah, this is a true story. I don't have to explain myself. I don't have to justify myself. At one point, I feared if I talked about being well, I would be thrown out of the rooms because God knows we're not supposed to be well in AA. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say it that way, but I've been criticized for talking about getting well rather than staying damaged. So anyway, you can probably tell that I'm, as we say, a satisfied customer of this deal. So I'm going to close with one more thought, and then we have a little bit of time for questions. I mean, I really appreciate you all being willing to listen to this, even if you're not live and you're going to hear it on the recordings and work your way through it. I have mixed feelings about talking about this stuff, partly because I'm aware, and this came up last time in the Q&A, that I'm not solidly in the way we talk about these things. And I don't relish the thought that people might hear me at odds with AA. AA saved my life. I have no regrets about AA. When I'm in a regular AA meeting, I don't talk much about this stuff. I find ways to talk about it that I think fit well enough, but I don't want to be a critic of AA. It's a beautiful thing and it works well for me, as do all these recovery things. But when you start seeing this stuff about yourself, you have to start talking about it somewhere, because it's the new ideas that are coming in. And I will close with this thought. This is going to sound slightly crazy, but I'm going to say it anyway. The evidence I have is that the upside never stops increasing in possibilities. A few years ago, I thought I was pretty well. I'm weller than I was then. I don't know how that happened. It's happened enough times now, though, that I can say that if I keep leaning into this recovery progressively and from a strengths point of view, if I keep doing the work, the fruits will continue to manifest in greater and greater form. I'm always a little reluctant to talk about that because I know that so many of us are cornered by our difficulties. It's like, nah, that's BS. That can't be true. But if I can't share about my experience, strength, and hope as I've lived it in these settings, that's not a positive statement about my recovery, nor is it a positive statement about the recovery practices we need to embody and live. We need to be able to talk about getting well. We need to be able to talk about becoming whole. We need to be able to talk about how some of these tragic histories can be made right, much to our surprise. We have to be able to talk about living in an amended way where I'm not the guy I used to be. My insides have been radically altered. And yes, I still have challenges. It's important to keep admitting that. So the reason I've concluded that I need to talk about these things, and some of you have heard me say this, because I think we need greater and greater infusions of hope, because this recovery thing is not always easy. We need to believe it's worth it. And there's that great line in the big book. This is my final thought, and then we'll cut it off and we can talk a little bit. There's that great line in There Is a Solution in the big book that says, essentially, we do this because we saw that it worked in others. That's why I'm telling you my experience. And we had seen the hopelessness and futility of life as we had been living it. That's what I've been trying to leave behind, the hopelessness and futility of being stuck in those things. So I'm incredibly optimistic for your recovery, just like I am for mine. I think that it is a launching pad we are on. And I would just call all of you to lean into this, see where it can take you. It may take you further than your wildest dreams. There may really be a fourth dimension, as they talk about in the big book. So I want to go there with you. That's it. Thanks for listening. Yeah, well, kudos to you and your good fortune for, the research shows that people over the age of 60, it is increasingly unlikely they will figure out how to get clean and sober. So you may be a miracle twice over, to be really honest. And I knew you were pretty, because I've seen you often in these forums, so I knew you were pretty committed. I didn't have any idea it's been 2 years, so that's an inspiring thing for me to know you can cover that kind of ground. So yay for this. And thanks for sharing that. And yes, yesterday's sobriety just won't get it done today. Well, you mentioned the right sizeness in the context of, that line about every day, my best day drunk, etc. It is just as dishonest to reject our gifts as it is to deny our deficits. It's just as dishonest. And yet our culture, certainly in recovery and more broadly, wants to reward us for being self-deprecating and everything. And there's a place for that. But, sometimes we get things right. We are in our strengths. We really do some things right. And we need to be able to say, wow, I did that right. I did that really well. And this too shall pass, because I may not do it the next time. So I think we have to be able to own that stuff too, because we're not all just, bags of crap. There's a lot that we do right that we need to own at the same time that we own the things that we're struggling with. So, that's a really good point you just made. It's something I learned in my recovery from love addiction. That's what I went in treatment for when 17 years sober. And which I always share because it's like, you need to know it's 17 years sober. You can need inpatient treatment. But the whole idea that a part of our progress must be self-care, self-nurturance. Many of us have been mistreated a lot. And many of us have internalized that as mistreating ourselves. And eventually that has to go too, because it doesn't really serve a good purpose other than making us feel bad and spiraling on ourselves. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you.